Hey everyone, welcome back to Horsetooth Cinema, and today I'm going to be reviewing Scream, the 2022 version that just came out, or Scream 5 as I guess this movie doesn't want you to call it. This movie was directed by Matt Bettinelli-Olpin and Tyler Gillett. And this is of course the first Scream movie to not be directed by Wes Craven, the iconic Wes Craven who has sadly passed away. And you get the sense watching this movie that this is very much a tribute to Wes Craven and what made the Scream movie, at least the original, so great. Now my exposure to the Scream movies, I really like them in general. I'm a big fan of the slasher subgenre. I think the original Scream I'll talk about a little bit more throughout the video, but it's probably one of the most perfect slasher movies ever made. And it's one of the best horror comedies I've ever seen, honestly. And then I actually haven't seen 2 and 4. And then my initial exposure to the Scream franchise was actually Scream 3, which is widely considered the worst of the bunch. It's I don't think it's bad, but it's definitely extremely messy and just very out there. I'll say that much. And naturally, going into this movie, I was pretty skeptical. Sequels in general usually are not as good as the original, and horror is a genre where that's really true. But I will say that this is one of the better horror sequels I've ever seen. So the plot of this movie is basically that in Woodsboro, California, where the previous Scream murders took place, there's a new killer at large. There's a group of high school, college-age kids that are, all suspicious of one another over who this new murderer is. Sidney Prescott, as well as the original cast, Courtney Cox and David Arquette's character, they have to come back to Woodsboro to sort of investigate these murders because their past is very much tied to them. Now, first off, again, I mentioned this is one of the better horror sequels I've seen. I was pleasantly surprised in a lot of ways. So I'm going to start off with talking about the things I really enjoyed. One of my favorite things about the original Scream was how it sort of had this meta quality to it. It sort of took a lot of the tropes that we're used to seeing in slasher movies and not only turned them on their head, but actually would analyze them a little bit and make fun of them. A lot of the characters in the original movie talk about the situations that they are in themselves and what people in those horror movies generally do, what generally gets people killed, etc. And it's a clever way to sort of, poke fun at the slasher genre while at the same time contributing to it in a very iconic way. Now this movie does not, I would say, analyze the slasher genre in that same way, but it does have its own meta-analysis that is actually quite distinct from the other films. And it really is looking at a few things. One, franchise filmmaking, and the other is highbrow horror movies. Now, in terms of franchise filmmaking, I thought this would be a good idea for them to do because obviously it's the 5th film in the franchise, it's a slasher movie. There's really little that you can do that's kind of unique in terms of actual storytelling, and there's not much in this film that, in terms of just the overall story, that really sets it apart from either the original or even Scream 3, for example. There's a lot of similarities with some of the plot. So they took this opportunity to kind of dissect franchise filmmaking in general. So in the world of the film, people have made a bunch of films about the Woodsboro killings. Instead of calling them Scream, they call them Stab. And there's been like 8 of these, and they sort of have a lot of scenes where they go and they talk about Stab movies. There are certain people in the film that are diehard fans of the Stab movies, and they're very defensive about them, and they will, if they feel like they're betrayed by a certain Stab movie that does something a bit different or experimental that they didn't like, they're very extremely critical about it as the movie gets in. I won't spoil anything. But it really reminds me of like Star Wars fans and how much backlash there really is nowadays to just what are ultimately movies, how much energy people actually put into criticizing what is ultimately just a piece of film that somebody spent a year working on, and ultimately it only cost the viewer a couple hours of their time. And yeah, it really put me in the shoes of back when The Last Jedi came out or Rise of Skywalker, and those aren't great movies for sure. I would have criticisms of them myself. They're nothing like the original Star Wars trilogy, obviously. And there is this corporate quality to them that I don't like, but also just the reaction that people gave to them was just so absurd and over the top. People saying that this destroyed my childhood, etc. That's really kind of the attitude that this movie is making fun of. And I really enjoyed that because I do think that we can get very over the top sometimes. There are a lot of times also where the movie is sort of poking fun at people who only enjoy quote-unquote highbrow horror. I'm of course talking about movies like The Shining, It Follows, Hereditary, a lot of stuff that comes out nowadays. And these movies are phenomenal, and I enjoy them myself. They're very psychological, and they really get to the root of things that are actually scary. But at the same time, there are a lot of people who really just discount a lot of just a bit more dumbed down horror, I guess you could say. Slasher movies would be a great example, where the premise is, you know, relatively simple, and oftentimes you have really stupid characters that end up just getting themselves killed for their purposes of entertainment. And this movie really pokes fun at people who think that those two things can't coexist together in the same universe of good horror. Because while slasher movies will never really challenge you cerebrally or really terrify you for the coming weeks, they're definitely a lot of fun, and they can be extremely well crafted. The original Scream, of course. I'm also thinking of movies like Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween. So, you know, I sort of went into this fifth Scream movie with expectations about it being meta quality and hopefully in a different meta sense than the original film and Scream 3. And I got that. Not only was it what I wanted, it was a completely fresh take on it that I really, really enjoyed. There are a couple criticisms I do have with this movie overall. It isn't exactly paced like the other Scream movies. It's not great at gripping you and keeping you invested in it. For example, you know, as a Scream fan, I really, of course, wanted to see Sidney Prescott in this movie. She probably doesn't show up for about the first 20-25 minutes or so. The characterization of these high schoolers kind of was a bit dull because, I mean, honestly, I know these high schoolers are, one, they're just slasher archetypes, and, you know, two, I know we're gonna see them get killed later in the film anyway. Why try and, you know, get me to be attached to any of them in any way? A lot of those scenes just felt like they were there to do the sort of meta analyzation of the slasher genre and highbrow horror films that I do enjoy, but it really kind of dragged sometimes. My other big criticism of this movie is that it doesn't feel like nearly as much of a horror comedy as it does as compared to the original Scream. A lot of people have really just categorized the original Scream in the slasher genre, but I really look at, like, watching that movie, that is a horror comedy done really well. And by horror comedy, I don't just mean that it's a funny movie that happens to also be a horror movie. I mean that the actual horror elements are funny. They're really funny. Certain movies nail this. Movies like Evil Dead 2, American Werewolf in London, basically whenever the big scare happens and the killer or the monster starts rushing towards a person, it's so absurd, it's so over the top, and they also show so much of it that it just comes across as hilarious, whereas if they, you know, were a little bit more cerebral about it, it could actually come off as really scary. And I'm not saying those scares from the original Scream aren't scary, they're frightening for sure, but how I view it is they sort of take away half the scare and fill that with comedy, and they have this sort of combination effect that you have where it's not as scary as, you know, a full horror movie scare would be, but it has this whole extra element of comedy that when done right really elevates it into its kind of its own unique thing. And this movie doesn't have as much of that as the original Scream. There are a couple sequences that I did laugh at a lot, actually, and of course all the jokes when characters are just talking, you know, it's done well, but I really wish I could have gotten more, like, again, like Evil Dead 2, American Werewolf in London type horror comedy scares. That would have been really great. Yeah, maybe I'm being a little too picky with this because honestly, I think this is kind of a hard movie to criticize because for a couple reasons. One, it's just like the other Scream, like the original Scream movie. It's so self-aware of itself. And it really doesn't take itself seriously at all, and that's kind of what I love about it. And also, just given that it's a tribute to Wes Craven, and I think, again, that this is a movie that he would absolutely love, you know, it's hard to criticize it for just looking at it from that point of view, because it really does have a sweet sentimental quality to it, especially with the image that they show when they roll the credits. I thought that was a really nice touch that they added. So overall, I'm gonna give this movie a B. I definitely don't think it's better than the original Scream or anything, but it is one of the better horror sequels I've ever seen. It understands everything that makes Scream the iconic franchise that it is, and it contributes to that in interesting ways, which, given the low standards that we've come to expect for horror sequels, I think that makes it pretty good. I would definitely recommend you guys checking it out if you get the chance. So yeah, that's going to do it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and if you like this video, you can like the video down below and subscribe to the channel. I'll have more content coming out soon, and I will see you guys in the next one. Thanks very much.